You're listening to the Future Tech Health Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Until I reached age 40, I never realized the obvious, that we all have medical issues, or we at least have a family member or close relation that has, or will have them in the future. Medicine and biological systems are the final frontier. Until we've conquered death, figured out how life began, cured cancer, and understood our purpose in the universe, there's a heck of a lot to talk about when it comes to our health. Future Tech Health means I'll be covering futuristic topics that are actually already in clinical trials, or even starting to appear on shelves or by prescription, or available for your own use. We dive deep into stem cells, CRISPR-Cas9, the science of sleep, epigenetics, medical testing, cancer, ketogenic diets, stem cells, aging, regenerative medicine, and more. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a serious medical problem. Remember, however, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoy the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and share it with friends. Thank you. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech and Future Tech Health podcast. I guess today we're going to be from two different companies, Phoenix and Shine. One of them couldn't make it because of travel, but it's okay. We've got Evan Sengbusch, PhD, is an MBA, and he's the president of Phoenix, and who is also supposed to attend. But the collaboration will still stand. We'll still talk about it. It was Greg Pfeiffer, the founder and CEO of Shine Medical. We're going to talk about their new collaboration. So, Evan, thanks for coming, first of all.
Hey, Richard. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, if you don't mind, tell me a little bit about Shine from what you know and a little bit about Phoenix, and then what's this collaboration about?
Sure, absolutely. So Shine spun out of Phoenix back in 2010 to focus on one specific application of the Phoenix technology, which is medical isotope production. And so while we're still, very close as companies, we are two separate entities. At Phoenix, we make essentially particle accelerators that generate a lot of neutrons. Shine is ultimately a customer of ours that will be using those neutron generators to produce medical isotopes that are used in nuclear medicine imaging procedures. So these are, radioisotopes that are used in diagnostic tests in medicine to detect cancer, heart disease, and 100 other different indications. There's one specific isotope that Shine will be manufacturing using the Phoenix technology called molybdenum-99, which is really the workhorse of nuclear medicine. It's used in more than one procedure every second around the world. So it works out to over 30 million procedures a year rely on this key isotope. And right now it's only produced in a few remaining nuclear reactors around the world. There's actually no production sites left in the Western Hemisphere. And so really the mission of Shine, and of course, a big part of Phoenix's business, is kind of filling that gap as reactors age and shut down, and we lose supply of this vital medical supply.
Okay, so an isotope is, to my understanding, an atom that has excess neutrons, causing it to be unstable and to radioactively decay in some fashion. Is that right?
Yeah, so, molybdenum-99, or Moly for short, it decays into another material, an isotope called technetium-99m. M means metastable. And essentially what it means is these materials are radioactive, meaning that they are constantly decaying and emitting radiation. In particular, they're emitting something called a gamma ray, which is basically a photon. So it's a form of light, kind of like an X-ray. And what you can do is you can take these isotopes, you can attach them to molecules that like to go to certain areas of the body. So you can attach them to glucose, for instance, which will go into the heart muscles. And then the materials, as they're attached to the heart muscle, will be emitting these gamma rays, this radiation. And you can use a special camera, something that looks kind of like an X-ray detector, and you can detect the gamma rays coming out of the body and get basically an image of the distribution of this isotope in the body, and that can give you an indication of the functionality of your heart, for instance, and diagnose, whether you've had a heart attack or if you're going to have a heart attack. The other big indication is it's very good at detecting cancer. So, cancerous cells are dividing more rapidly than normal cells. They use up sort of more, again, to use the sugar analog, glucose, than other cells. And so they'll kind of show up as a brighter spot on the image from the camera than normal tissue. And this is one of many tools that are used very regularly to detect, cancer in the body.
Well, what are some of the factors that are important in making this as safe as possible? I mean, it doesn't sound very good, obviously to have gamma radiation, in your body, coming out of your body. So, the choice of atom, substrate, or template, I guess, whatever you want to call it, the amount of gamma rays that are coming out, how are all these factors important? How do they boil in?
Yeah, so the good news is this type of medical procedure has been done for decades. This is not a new procedure. It's very well understood, and it's actually very safe. The reason it's so safe is that the quantities of radioactive material we're talking about here are absolutely minuscule. So to put it in perspective, the Shine facility, which is currently being built about 45 minutes south of here in Janesville, Wisconsin, this is a big nuclear grade facility. Total investment is, I think, north of $250 million. So a lot of money going in. There's a lot of big, hardware. There's going to be 8 Phoenix neutron sources running this plant. It's essentially going to operate 24 hours a day, 50 weeks a year. And the total output of useful material in a year from that production facility will be about a half of a sugar packet's worth of material. And that half of a sugar packet will be divided up into about 15 million different individual patient doses all around the world. So, you can imagine taking half a sugar packet and slicing it up into 15 million pieces, and that's the quantity that goes into any individual patient for one of these tests. So the quantities of material we're talking about here are very, very small, such that the dose, the radiation dose that any individual patient gets is actually very, very small, and the risk from having a just minuscule amount of radiation compared to the benefit of the diagnostic procedure is quite obvious, and it has been done for a long time. The real challenge is being able to produce, transport the isotopes in a safe and economically effective way. And so historically, the only way that people have known how to do this is to use nuclear reactors. And in fact, most of the nuclear reactors that have made this stuff use highly enriched uranium, which the U.S. government considers to be a weapons threat, because this is material that could, if got into the wrong hands, be turned into a bomb. And so one of the ways that Phoenix and Shine got started is we were an awardee of a $25 million cooperative agreement from the U.S. Department of Energy back in 2010 that was geared towards developing a way to produce this key medical isotope in a way that does not use highly enriched uranium, and also just developing a domestic supply in the U.S. And so, our concept, in contrast to using a nuclear reactor with lots of uranium and all the regulatory burden that goes along with it, we're actually using a particle accelerator. So, accelerating a beam of ions, not radioactive, using those to generate neutrons, which sort of serve as the catalyst for a reaction that does use some radioactive material, but 1,000 times lower quantities of radioactive material than a reactor uses, which means that for us, the licensing and regulatory path is much simpler. We generate 1,000 times less waste than a reactor. And then the benefit for the U.S., which uses about half of the global supply of Moly-99, is that we're closer to the end users in the hospitals. One of the challenges with this radioactive material is that because it's radioactive, it's disappearing constantly. So you lose about 1% of your product every single hour. So the minute it's produced, you're already starting to lose it. So, one of the big producers, for example, is in Australia. Shipping this stuff from Australia to the U.S., you lose about a third of your product just through the decay during the shipping process. So that's another advantage we'll have being a local producer.
Is the half-life then what, about 48 hours?
66 hours.
Okay. All right. So again, for listeners, that's the amount of time it takes for half the radioactivity of the material to have dissipated, right?
Yep, that's exactly right.
Well, so what can you say about the process of creating Moly-99? And I'm sure maybe all of it's proprietary, I don't know. But what can you say about it? Maybe can you give a little bit more detail on how it's made, just out of curiosity?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there are parts of it that are proprietary, but I think the general concept, certainly I can talk to. So, the approach that we're taking is actually a hybrid that combines both nuclear fusion and nuclear fission. So nuclear, what most people are familiar with is nuclear fission. This is where you take a material like uranium or plutonium, and you're basically splitting the atom in half or into pieces. And when you do that, you release energy. One of the challenges with fission is that it does result in these very long-lived waste products. So these are radioactive materials that might have half-lives, of 1 million years or more, meaning they're a pretty significant disposal challenge, just because it takes a very long time for them to go away. Nuclear fusion is sort of the opposite. So nuclear fusion, you're basically taking two light elements. In our case, we're actually taking two different isotopes of hydrogen, and we're basically smashing them together to create a new atom. In this case, it's helium. But one of the byproducts of that reaction is a free neutron. So we, smash these two hydrogen atoms together, create helium, and then we release a free neutron. And that free neutron is sort of the useful thing that Phoenix makes. And so sort of the core innovation from Phoenix's perspective is we've developed an accelerator technology that's just much higher output than has been available in the past. And so, when we operate one of our systems, we're generating something like 10 trillion neutrons per second, on that order. So just a really high quantity of neutrons. And then what we do is we couple that fusion neutron source with what's called a subcritical assembly, which is basically a liquid bath of low enriched uranium dissolved in water. And the neutrons that we created with our particle accelerator then go out, they interact with the low enriched uranium in the water, which is not, weapons grade. And when those neutrons smash into the uranium, they split the uranium up, and 6% of the time when you break uranium in half, the byproduct is Moly-99, which is really the useful material. And so the Shine facility will actually have 8 sort of redundant systems that look like this. So you'll have 8 Phoenix particle accelerators coupled with these subcritical assemblies, each of which will be generating substantial quantities of these medical isotopes.
Okay, so you create the Moly-99. Just going back to the part where it's in the human body, how do you characterize the amount of radiation? Is it like in millisieverts or microsieverts or millicuries, and what are the approximate levels?
Yeah, so millicuries would be sort of a dose, a quantity of radioactive material that goes into the body. I think a typical dose is, I think it's down in the microcuries for a typical technetium scan, and then of course you can also measure the radioactivity coming out of a person that gets one of those procedures. That would be measured in either microsieverts or millirem, which are effectively the same unit. Again, the doses are, I don't know off the top of my head what a typical dose to a patient is, but it's, far, far below any type of regulatory limit or any, level where there'd be concern that there's a serious health impact. Maybe a good analog would be, I think people are maybe more familiar with a CT scan where you're essentially using an X-ray machine to look through a human. You certainly get sort of more dose from a typical CT scan, more radiation dose than you would from many of these nuclear medicine procedures that utilize a radioactive isotope. And again, the reason for this is, the reason Moly-99 is such a special isotope is that the type of gamma radiation that comes off of it is sort of the perfect energy for this type of procedure. So it's a high enough energy that the gamma ray basically is emitted and goes through your body with minimal interaction in your tissue, but it's low enough energy that once it gets out of your body, you're able to detect it with high efficiency with these, gamma cameras is what they're called, which is basically the detector that you use. And so ultimately what that means is you don't need to use very much of this material at all to get a high quality image. And, the secondary effect is that the amount of radiation that the patient gets is minuscule.
Yeah, I had a family member that had the iodine-131, which was very different. That was, 80, 100 millicurie dose. And, she had to stay away from people for 10 or 11 days. And, I guess it was a totally different story, much higher dosage, but a little bit of similarity, I guess.
Yeah, no, definitely. And in fact, iodine-131 is another isotope that Shine will be making at their facility. The difference between what your family member had and the traditional Moly-99 procedure is typically iodine-131 is used as a therapeutic isotope. So this is when somebody's already been diagnosed with a disease and they're actually trying to treat, oftentimes it's thyroid cancer, using a radioactive material. So now you're actually trying to use the radioactive material to kill the cancer, meaning the doses are much, much higher. And there certainly is, there is dose to normal tissue that is undesired, but of course you have to weigh that risk against, leaving the cancer there. So it's a very different situation when you're using these isotopes for therapy versus as a diagnostic procedure where the quantities are significantly less. However,
right, exactly.
I would say that there is, there's a growing interest in using different isotopes in what people would call targeted molecular radioisotope therapy, where it's similar to iodine, but as the biologists get better and better at coming up with molecules that can target cancerous cells and not normal tissue, you can attach radioactive isotopes to those molecules that accumulate in cancerous cells. And if you can really localize the presence of the material only in the tumor and not in normal tissue, this can represent a pretty impactful type of cancer therapy if you can localize that radiation dose only to the cancerous cells and not to the normal tissue. So there's a lot of research being done in that space currently, and it's sort of an up-and-coming treatment modality for cancer.
What's the big goal of Phoenix here? Is it to reestablish production of Moly-99 in the U.S. and be one of the few remaining providers, or is it to figure out new isotopes, or is it a new method of making Moly? Like, what would you say the focus is?
Yeah, so this is where you kind of need to distinguish a little bit between Shine and Phoenix, and that our missions are a little bit different. So Shine's primary mission is to become the global leader in manufacturing Moly-99 in a way that does not require a nuclear reactor. So it is a new production technique. And then beyond that, they are also looking to produce other isotopes. They, in fact, recently made an announcement that they have a new program in place to start producing an isotope called lutetium-177, which is one of those sort of up-and-coming therapeutic isotopes. So there's a drug on the market that's currently been approved that uses lutetium for certain types of cancer therapy. Prostate cancer is one of the big indications that people are looking at. So that's really Shine's focus. Phoenix's focus is a little bit different in that, our specialty is really making these very high output neutron sources. So for us, the medical application is only one of several different applications that we're pursuing. So we're also utilizing these neutron sources to do industrial imaging, for instance. So we just opened up a new neutron imaging facility here in Madison, Wisconsin, where we'll be inspecting things like turbine blades that go in the middle of an aircraft engine. And so this is, you can think of it kind of like an X-ray inspection. The turbine blades are a good example in that effectively what neutrons are really good at doing is penetrating high density material like metal and visualizing low density stuff. And in this particular case, what we're looking for is ceramic material that can get sort of caught in the cooling channels of these turbine blades as part of the manufacturing process. And so, a lot of people don't realize this, but in the middle of a jet engine, when you're up, next time flying on an airplane, looking out the window at the engine, the middle of that engine is operating at about 1,300 degrees Celsius, which is about the temperature of molten lava. It's in fact higher than the melting point of the metal that the turbine blades are made of. And so,
oh wow,
the only thing that keeps these blades from essentially melting and self-destructing is by very, very good active cooling through these complex cooling channels that are formed through the middle of these blades. And if you have just a tiny bit of residual ceramic material from the manufacturing process, it can cause a localized hotspot that in a worst case scenario would melt the blade, take an engine down, and potentially take a plane down. And neutrons historically are really the only way that you can detect this type of ceramic material, because they're the only thing that's able to penetrate the metal and visualize the low density material. So historically, this has been done at nuclear reactors for decades, and Phoenix is really the first company to have developed a technology that allows you to do this same technique without the use of a nuclear reactor. So, that's one example of another use of the Phoenix technology. But very broadly, we're looking to replace the use of nuclear reactors for a broad range of different applications, like non-destructive testing, as I mentioned. We're also involved with some commercial and government partners on developing fusion energy systems. So there's, a lot of investment of late, sort of both in the public sector and privately in new fusion energy generation technologies. The joke is that every billionaire has a fusion company that they've invested in, but it's true. The Bezoses and Gateses of the world all have invested substantial money in new fusion energy startups. And one of the challenges for those fusion energy companies is that all fusion reactor concepts will generate lots of neutrons. And it's unclear that we have properly engineered materials to withstand the very high neutron fluxes. And so one of the tools that Phoenix can provide these companies and government labs are these very high output neutron sources that will allow them to characterize the subsystems that will need to operate in these future energy sources under these high neutron flux environments.
Is a neutron a neutron a neutron, or are there different subtle types of them, or do they have different attributes that could distinguish them when they're produced?
Yeah, good. That's a great question. So a neutron is a neutron is a neutron. However, there's an important attribute that is very meaningful, which is the energy of the neutron has a big impact in terms of how it interacts with material. And so, for instance, when you think about the fusion energy reactors, most of the concepts utilize a reaction known as the DT reaction, which stands for deuterium tritium. These are the two isotopes of hydrogen that I mentioned earlier. So these are kind of the easiest elements that nature has provided us for nuclear fusion. However, one of the sort of downsides is that when you have a DT fusion reaction, which releases a lot of energy, it also releases a neutron that has relatively high energy. So 14 mega electron volts, 14 million electron volts is the amount of energy that a neutron has that comes off of a DT reaction. And those high energy neutrons are particularly damaging to materials and electronic circuits. And so in order to appropriately test computer systems and materials in these high neutron flux environments, not only do you need a lot of neutrons, but you need neutrons of the right energy. And so the fact that we at Phoenix inherently utilize the same nuclear fusion reaction that these reactor concepts are looking at mean that we produce not only a lot of neutrons, but the right energy of neutrons to do this type of testing.
Is the amount of energy a neutron has quantized? And could you put, when you do a reaction, can you run the neutrons that come out of it through a filter that would exclude certain energies, only allow other energies through?
In some circumstances, you can do that at very low neutron energies, but generally no. So, you can slow neutrons down by letting them bounce off material, but it's very difficult to select sort of a specific energy band. So, one of the process of slowing neutrons down is called thermalization or moderation. And effectively what you do is you just let the neutrons bounce around in some media. Often, graphite is used, or heavy water, or polyethylene, or even regular water is actually a decent neutron moderator. The challenge is you can't say, I'm going to use this amount of material and take my neutrons from 14 MeV down to 7 MeV. What happens is it's kind of a random process. So you end up with this very broad energy spectrum of neutrons. So it's difficult to sort of use moderation to get to a specific desired neutron energy spectrum. To your initial question, the neutron energy isn't necessarily quantized, but depending on the reaction, there's a pretty narrow band of neutrons that are born from that reaction. So, I mentioned the DT reaction. Pretty much all the neutrons that come out of that reaction have about 14 MeV. Not exactly. There's a band there, but it's right in that range. Another common fusion reaction is the DD reaction, deuterium-deuterium. Those neutrons are all born with about 2.5 MeV of energy, for instance. And then there are other reactions that create neutrons where there's a whole broad range of neutron energies as opposed to sort of a single energy line.
Once neutrons are produced, can you keep them, like magnetically keep them constrained in a bottle and make like a soup of neutrons? Or once you make them, you have to use them right away?
Unfortunately, you cannot keep your neutrons around. Yeah, once you make them, you have to use them right away. So, because neutrons are inherently neutral, hence their name, they don't interact with magnetic fields or electric fields because they don't have charge. And so there's really no way to put them in a storage ring or something like that. So you essentially have to use them immediately once you've made them. Essentially, if you don't, they're gone, nearly instantaneously on a time scale of, milliseconds, which is, a challenge, but it's also a benefit. So, that's one of the benefits of the Phoenix and the Shine approach for medical isotope production, for instance, is that there's an inherent safety benefit that the minute that we switch off our machine, and it's literally, press a button on the keyboard or click a mouse, turns the machine off. The minute we do that, the radiation goes away, which is very different than a nuclear reactor where you have lots of radioactive material and it's actually operating in a sort of self-sustained reaction. This is known as criticality. And so I mentioned earlier, we use a type of process called a subcritical reaction. And what that means is that we develop the process in such a way that it can never, there could never be a meltdown because it is not it's not a self-sustaining reaction. The minute we flip the off switch, all the radiation goes away in a matter of milliseconds. So there's a great safety benefit to using these accelerator-based systems in comparison to traditional reactor techniques.
Is there any way to generate neutrons and have them, collide with other atoms that have, let's say, a longer half-life that would then consequently re-emit neutrons, just maybe at a slower rate or a more predictable rate? And by that way, you're essentially harvesting them and building them up for a later time. Is that a technique, or is that just wrong speculation?
No, another good question. Yeah, so there are radioactive materials that are neutron emitters that can effectively be kind of, a storage source for neutrons, if you will. A good example would be an isotope called californium-252. And this is, in fact, an example of another isotope that we're actively replacing the use of californium-252 with our neutron sources. And the reason for that is these materials that are radioactive and emit neutrons are actually pretty dangerous in that, again, there's sort of no way to press the off button, and they're also very difficult to produce. So there's only two places in the world that make californium-252. There's a nuclear reactor at Oak Ridge National Lab in Tennessee, and there's a reactor in Russia. Those are the only two places that make this stuff. And in order to make it, you have to go through 14 different elemental transmutations before you end up with californium-252. So it's an incredibly difficult process requires very, very specialized and unique resources. And then once you've made it, it's a very dangerous substance to handle because it's constantly emitting sort of high levels of neutron radiation. And so this touches on another application of the Phoenix technology. We're currently building, and in fact, recently just installed our first neutron-based system to inspect nuclear fuel that goes into nuclear reactors that generate electricity. So, a typical reactor that generates electricity. And right now in the U.S., for example, about 20% of the electrical grid is powered by nuclear. These reactors have to be refueled about every 18 months. So every year and a half, they'll put new fuel in. And one of the key characteristics of the fuel is the enrichment. So enrichment is, the ratio of uranium-235, which is the sort of useful stuff, to the uranium-238, which is the sort of non-radioactive uranium that's just sort of the background material. And so the reactors are designed with a very specific enrichment profile. And so the nuclear fuel that is manufactured to go refuel these reactors has to be tested to ensure that it has the right enrichment distribution. Otherwise, you can end up with a localized hotspot. If you have a higher enriched, fuel pellet versus the design, it could cause the rod to leak. You have radioactive material in your cooling water, and this could very quickly be a $100 million type of disaster. So historically, what people have done is they've used californium-252, this neutron-emitting isotope, to inspect the nuclear fuel. Basically, you shoot neutrons at the fuel. When the neutrons hit the uranium, it emits radiation in the form of gamma rays. You can measure those gamma rays, and essentially the number of gamma rays that you count is indicative of the enrichment of the fuel. However, for the reasons I talked about before, people really don't like to deal with californium-252 because it's a big regulatory hazard. It's difficult to get. It's very, very expensive. And so we're in the process of transitioning most of the major nuclear fuel manufacturers away from californium-252 to basically an electronic machine that looks more like, an X-ray system that has an on and an off switch that can produce the same number of neutrons that they're used to using with the californium.
How are there any applications in which neutrons are produced and then shot at a substance to do diagnostics? Like, in the engine example, to test for the presence of ceramics, like how would you use neutrons to do that? And what are some other ways that neutrons can be used? Like, I'm sure you guys have thought through like every way possible you could and how they could be used. So, and other examples?
Yeah, absolutely. So another good example would be there in like satellites and spacecraft. There's a lot of small energetic charges. Energetic is just another word, I guess, for explosive, that are used to separate the stages of the booster or, deploy the satellite once it gets up into the upper atmosphere. There's a very niche market that most people aren't familiar with, but there can be, hundreds or even thousands of these small explosive charges that are used as part of either the launch process or the deployment or a lot of different parts of space travel. And of course, these are very sort of mission critical systems where if they fail, the cost of failure is high in that, if your $1 billion satellite doesn't deploy correctly, that's a lot of money down the drain. And so people invest a lot of money on inspecting these types of components to ensure that they were manufactured appropriately. And neutron inspection is one of the key techniques to do that, because again, you're sort of facing this situation where often these components have a lot of metal around the outside, and you have to be able to see through that metal and visualize these very small quantities of energetic material to essentially ensure that they don't have any cracks or voids or discontinuities or bubbles in the energetic fill. And you essentially can't do this with any other inspection technique. X-rays, can't penetrate the metal and they won't visualize the energetic material. Ultrasound doesn't work. None of the other techniques can really do this other than neutron imaging. And so historically, this has been done at just a handful of reactors around the country and outside of the country. But one of the challenges is that, we haven't really been building nuclear reactors in this country for 50 years now. And so most of the places that used to do this are, have either been decommissioned or they're approaching the end of their life. And so there really, is sort of a looming crisis for the people that make turbine blades and these energetic components and a range of other components where they're going to lose access to neutrons as these reactors to continue to shut down. And one of our objectives as a company is to basically fill that gap and provide an alternative source of neutrons to ensure continued quality of these types of components that are used in, primarily aerospace applications.
Yeah, I thought there was a new breed of nuclear reactors coming online that used, instead of solid cooling rods, liquid ones, and, they were much higher tech and safer. Is that not going to take the place of existing nuclear plants?
Not for this type of application. So what I think what you're talking about are what's commonly known as SMRs, or small modular reactors, which I personally am a huge supporter of, and there's a lot of people doing a lot of really good work on this type of stuff. However, those reactors are inherently designed to produce energy. They're really not designed to produce neutrons for these other applications, and just the sort of the geometry of the way these systems are manufactured make it impossible to gain access to the neutrons that are produced, because they're essentially all bottled up in this, giant enclosure that's used to produce energy. And so I guess I should have specified, these reactors that I mentioned that are aging and going away that are used for these aerospace inspections, these are not the same reactors that generate electricity. It's a different class of reactor, typically called a research reactor. So they're smaller reactors. They have a very different geometry, and they have these specialized what are called beam lines, and they're basically long ports that give you direct access to the core of the nuclear reactor, which is where the neutrons come from. That same concept just doesn't exist in a traditional power reactor, and it won't in the new SMRs either.
All right, got it. And then just a couple more questions, just backtracking a little bit. So if you are going to be diagnosing, you said like for certain materials, you can't use X-rays, you can't use anything but neutrons to, I guess, look at the structure of it. What are you doing there? Are you shooting neutrons at an object, and the ones that don't collide, that come through, create a pattern on the other side, which tells you the structure of the object? Or how does that work?
Yep, you got it exactly right. It's very analogous to sort of the way X-rays work. So, there's a couple different flavors of it. The most basic is just a simple transmission image, meaning you've got a neutron source on one side of your object that you're inspecting. The neutrons pass through that object. Some of them are absorbed by the object, some of them are not. The ones that make it through will hit a detector. This could be old school film, or, more commonly these days, some type of digital detector that can detect those neutrons. And then ultimately you end up with a picture that shows you the internal structure of that object through which the neutrons passed. Sort of the next step for that is to do 3D imaging or tomography. And we're in fact being funded currently by the Army to develop some neutron tomography here at our facility in Madison. And in that case, you're basically taking a number of different of these transmission images from different angles, and then you use sort of computerized reconstruction software to take all of that data and generate a three-dimensional image of the interior of the object. So it's basically the same way that a medical CT scan works for a person, but in this case, rather than using X-rays, we're using neutrons, and rather than looking at people, we're looking at, a rocket motor, for instance, amongst, many other types of components. And then to take it even one step further, one of the things we're also currently being funded by the government to develop is basically a neutron X-ray fusion imaging technique, where we'd basically be taking an image of a component with neutrons and X-rays at the same time. And in this case, it's a three-dimensional image. And basically what you get out of that is, because neutrons and X-rays interact with material very differently, they both provide sort of complementary but distinct information about what's inside your part. And so by using both neutrons and X-rays, you can get this sort of hybrid image which gives you a really unique view to the inside of what you're looking at. We think of this as being very analogous to what's commonly done in medicine with PET, positron emission tomography, and CT, computed tomography. So these are two common imaging procedures that are used in medicine these days, where you'll do a CT scan of a person. This is, using X-rays to shoot it through the body, and you're basically getting information about the anatomy of the person. So you'll see the bone and the tissue, and you can create a three-dimensional image. And then at the same time, or maybe right afterwards, you'll also do a PET scan, positron emission tomography, which gives you functional information about the person. So things like, blood flow and metabolism within the person. And then you can combine those two images to create a hybrid image, which is sort of more powerful than either image on its own. And we're trying to take the similar approach with neutrons and X-rays for some of these, very challenging industrial applications.
Yeah, I was just thinking of that. If I had to go for a scan and I could get a PET and an MRI and a CT all in one, the doctors would probably see a lot more, and it would be less time, and it would really be great if you could do something like that, plus X-rays,
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, that is the direction things are moving. So there are, hybrid scanners in existence today that can do both PET and CT. I don't think there's the trifecta yet that includes MRI as well, but absolutely, the more diagnostic information you're able to get, the better job the physicians are able to do in terms of determining, what's wrong and prescribing the appropriate treatment course.
So how long until other sources, other neutron suppliers go, hey, what's the amount of time you think you have until there's going to be a big need for your stuff?
We're already there. It's basically already happened. So, if you think about the medical isotope production application, the last reactor in the Western Hemisphere that was producing Moly-99 shut down in 2018. And so there have already been major shortages of this isotope because these reactors have unexpected outages, pipe breaks, whatever. And they could go down for weeks or months at a time. And this has already happened several times over the last, decade or so. And what this means is when those reactors are down, because you can't stockpile Moly-99 because it's always decaying away, there are shortages of this isotope, which means that patients can't get the diagnostic procedures that they need, and physicians have to rely on sort of a plan B procedure, which is not as effective. So this is really one of the things that sort of spurred the investment from the Department of Energy back in the 2009 timeframe. The first major shortage of isotopes from reactors going down was way back in 2006. And that's been repeated many times over, and it's only getting worse now that there's less and less reactors producing this. I think there's only 4 remaining reactors in the world that make this isotope. So the crisis in some ways is sort of already upon us. The good news is that our production facility is already being built. Shine was issued its construction permit from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission a couple years ago. This was the first such permit that's been issued since 1960. So it's been a very long time since this type of facility has been built. And in fact, our operating license was docketed by the NRC just a couple months ago, which means we're on track to be commercially producing isotopes by 2022. On the other side, the industrial application, there's only basically 3 places left in the United States, nuclear reactors that provide neutrons for this, imaging and non-destructive inspection applications that we've touched on. And there's 1 place left in Canada. One of those reactors is likely going to go down in 2021, and the others are not far behind. So it's a pretty urgent need, and we're working very hard to be able to fill those gaps when they open up.
Well, very good. Well, Evan, what's the best way for people to find out more about Phoenix and Shine?
Website's probably the easiest. So phoenixwi.com is the Phoenix website, and there's lots of information on the various applications that we've talked about here and on the technology as well. And then Shine is shinemed.com is their website as well, or probably easiest to find us by Google. Shouldn't be tough to find either of us. And
Right, Evan, thank you for coming. I appreciate it.
Yeah, great discussion. I appreciate you having us on.
You're listening to the Future Tech Health Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Until I reached age 40, I never realized the obvious, that we all have medical issues, or we at least have a family member or close relation that had, has, or will have them in the future. Medicine and biological systems are the final frontier. Until we've conquered death, figured out how life began, cured cancer, and understood our purpose in the universe, there's a heck of a lot to talk about when it comes to our health. Future Tech Health means I'll be covering futuristic topics that are actually already in clinical trials, or even starting to appear on shelves or by prescription, or available for your own use. We dive deep into stem cells, CRISPR-Cas9, the science of sleep, epigenetics, medical testing, cancer, ketogenic diets, stem cells, aging, regenerative medicine, and more. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a serious medical problem. Remember, however, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and share it with friends. Thank you.